CBGB's was a legendary rock venue in New York's East Village that was open for over 3 decades with a capacity of just 350 people. But whatever happened to it and the famous name? Well, the answer may surprise you in today's video. First things first, you might be familiar with the famous awning at 315 Bowery that read CBGB OMFUG. But what does it stand for? Club owner Hilly Crystal originally named the club Country Bluegrass Blues with the tagline "Other music for uplifting gormandizers." Ironically, the acts they booked though sounded nothing like country or bluegrass. It was a running joke that even the U in OMFUG would change on a weekly basis. CBGB's was located in the East Village on Bowery Street, which in the early 70s was a hub for prostitutes and drug addicts and full of rundown buildings as well as garbage and graffiti. Today, the area has been gentrified. Originally, the club had the same owner, a guy named Hilly Crystal, but it had a different name, Hilly's on Bowery, which lasted from 1969 to 1972. Two locals convinced Crystal to start booking musical acts. A local act named Squeeze would be the first band to ever perform at CBGB's. When the Mercer Arts Center building, which had been a hub for upcoming musicians in New York City, suddenly collapsed in August of '73, they flocked to CBGB's to form a new music community there. The club would be famous for launching the careers of pretty big acts including the Ramones, Blondie, Talking Heads, and Patti Smith, among many others who wouldn't be as commercially successful, but they still greatly influenced the development of the punk rock sound, including acts like Dead Boys, New York Dolls, and Television. Owner Hilly Crystal was a professional musician himself, which gave him a unique insight into what musicians wanted out of a venue. This was certainly one of the keys to its success. He had 2 rules at his club. One was that acts had to play mostly original music instead of covers, and the second was that they had to set up their own equipment. However, it's been speculated that Crystal didn't want to pay royalties, hence why he didn't have bands play cover tunes. Before we talk about why CBGB's closed, let's do a quick rundown of some of the famous acts who passed through its doors and how the sound of the acts playing there evolved over time. In the 70s, acts like Television and the New York Dolls would lead the way with experimental sounds that moved away from overproduced and watered-down rock. In an interview, Joey Ramone talked about how Dee Dee's taste in music led them to play at CBGB's, being quoted as saying, "I loved Television, that was CBGB's to me. Some lonely night with 10 people there and Television playing." Patti Smith, meanwhile, sometimes called the godmother of punk, was one of the first and last artists to perform at CBGB's, and she talked about what was going on in the music scene in the early 70s in a 2015 interview with the BBC, being quoted as saying, "I felt that our cultural voice, which was so magnificent through the late 60s and early 70s, was faltering. And there was this rise of stadium rock and glam rock and all these different things, and I felt like somebody had to save it. I didn't think that it would be me, but I thought I could play a role." Debbie Harry, meanwhile, of the band Blondie, was a regular performer at CBGB's in the early to mid-70s. In 1978, Elvis Costello played there, and the Police did their first ever American show at the venue later that year. It was by the 80s the scene at CBGB's held on to its experimental roots, but shifted to a much harder sound. It became a hub for hardcore punk thanks to something called Thrash Day, which was every Sunday where hardcore bands played from the afternoon well into the night, and it included acts like Agnostic Front, Murphy's Law, Cro-Mags, Gorilla Biscuits, Sick of It All, and Youth of Today. But by 1990, violence soon erupted regularly inside and outside the club, often linked to skinheads who frequented the venue. When it became a problem, Crystal officially stopped running Thrash Day. Up until the late 80s, next door to CBGB's was the CBG Record Canteen, which was a record shop and cafe for many years. But by the end of the decade, it would be replaced by an art gallery and a performance stage called CB's 313 Gallery. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, CBGB's featured an eclectic lineup of groups, which even included some already successful commercial acts like Sum 41, Korn, and Green Day. But ultimately, it wasn't shifting musical taste that spelled the end of the club. It was actually a simple rent dispute with the local residents association. The monthly rent for the venue was $19,000, but Crystal got behind on his payments and at one point was sued for $90,000 that he owed to the Bowery Residents Committee. He refused to pay, arguing that he hadn't been billed properly for the rent increases, and the dispute soon went to court, where a judge deemed that the club should be made a landmark, but it was also up to the Bowery Residents Committee to renew the lease. In a 2006 article from the Berkshire Eagle, Crystal talked about the inevitable end of CBGB, saying, "My lawyer said you can't win the case. The law is that your lease is up, and they don't even need a reason to put you out. The residence committee nearly doubled the rent to $35,000 a month, and it was at that point Crystal didn't renew and announced plans to relocate CBGB's to Las Vegas. In the last months of the club being opened, it would be a local New York promoter called Rocks Off that booked many of the acts that had helped make CBGB's famous in the first place in hopes of saving the venue. This included performances by acts like Avail, The Bouncing Souls, Bad Brains, The Dictators, and an acoustic set by Blondie. In her 2019 memoir, Face It, Debbie Harry talked about her memories of CBGB's, writing, "Inside the club had its own special reek, a pungent compound of stale beer, cigarette smoke, dog shit, and body odor." In an interview with the New York Times, she would add, "I remember performing on stage at CBGB's and thinking to myself, I'm really having a great time and no one's ever going to see this except these 25 people that are here." She would add, "It would be a great way to learn to perform. I wasn't being microscopically observed." Unfortunately, the club would close 33 years after its inception, and the final concert would be played by Patti Smith, who would be accompanied by Flea from the Chili Peppers and television's Richard Lloyd on October 15, 2006. Smith would pass out lapel pins with a quote that read, "What remains is future." Not soon after, in August of 2007, Crystal would pass away at the age of 75 after a battle with lung cancer. CBGB's closed, but the interior remained untouched and it wouldn't be relocated to Vegas. The famous awning would be relocated to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. John Hallstrom, Punk Magazine's founding editor and illustrator for 2 of the Ramones album covers, had this to say about Crystal's legacy in a 2007 article from Stay Thirsty Media Online. "Hilly was a good guy and a good friend. CBGB would never have become the birthplace of punk rock if it wasn't for his policy of running a club that invited creative people to use it as if it was their second home. Also, his decision to keep the club true to its roots is what made him more famous in the decades to come. I wrote in 1976 that anyone can become a rock star despite or because of their musical talent, and CBGB is what backed me up on that, and that is how punk rock happened. But more important, why it stayed alive for 30-odd years." The New York Times would report that Crystal, prior to his death, had agreed to sell the club's assets to 2 entrepreneurs, James Blue Weiss and Robert Williams. It was reported that they bought the rights from Crystal's estate sometime in 2008, but they soon declared bankruptcy by 2010, and a myriad of legal issues soon followed. Hilly's ex-wife Karen Crystal challenged the sale, claiming that she was the rightful owner, and she soon got into a prolonged legal battle with her daughter Lisa Crystal Bergman over the reported $3 million estate. Crystal's daughter ultimately won the bulk of the money after its creditors were paid. It was following CBGB's closing that CBGB's Fashion, a retail store and wholesale department, and an online store would remain in the space, later moving to St. Mark's Square and later closing in 2008. Now vacant, a large pharmacy chain, a major bank, a restaurant group, and a men's clothing designer were all set to be looking at leasing the space sometime in 2008. It would be successful men's designer John Varvatos, who designed a successful rock-influenced clothing line, following a stint working for Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren, who successfully secured the lease and went on to open his famous clothing store at 315 Bowery. Being a fan of rock music, he truly appreciated the history of the space. In a YouTube interview with Salesforce, John Varvatos talked about how he would come to CBGB's in the late 70s, driving up from Michigan where he was attending college. As he designed the store, he'd be quoted as saying, "We tried to keep as much of the heart and soul as possible." Since becoming a men's clothing store, the space has hosted over 150 live shows. Varvatos has maintained some of the original elements of CBGB's, like the playbills, the rock and roll stickers on the wall, and even the graffiti wall, although the disgusting toilet, which is the stuff of legends, was moved to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, just like the awning. But Varvatos hasn't been without his detractors, as some have criticized the designer for commercializing the old space, selling graphic tees for over $100 and leather jackets for over $2,000, unless of course you shop at the outlet. But let's face it, would you guys rather have a clothing store with some elements intact or a bank that got rid of the whole thing? A number of spin-offs using the CBGB name would soon follow. CBGB Radio would launch on Sirius XM in 2010. In 2012, a group of investors purchased the naming rights to CBGB, and there was a CBGB Music Festival that was held in New York in 2012 that featured over 300 acts. There were even rumors that the investors, who had original ties to the Bowery establishment, were planning on opening a downtown location for the club, but those didn't seem to come to fruition. Ironically, Chris Novoselic of Nirvana gave a keynote speech for the festival, even though Nirvana never played CBGB's, because their manager was holding out for $300 additional. A 2013 film by the same name starring Alan Rickman as Hilly Crystal would be released, but it was a commercial flop. The film, funny enough, even featured a cameo from Foo Fighters drummer Taylor Hawkins, who plays Iggy Pop interrupting Debbie Harry's set in a fictionalized scene. 2013 CBGB's one-time space would be added to the National Register of Historic Places. Then, in a strange twist, in 2015 CBGB reopened as a poorly reviewed restaurant called CBGB Lab in Terminal C of the Newark Airport, a far cry from its roots as a gritty cutting-edge music venue. The venue houses a piano and some elements that look like they were taken from the original CBGBs. You can order your meal off the iPad, the menu looks like a typical restaurant you'd find at really any airport, and you can purchase merchandise with the CBGB logo on it in addition to buying albums. Vice would document their experience eating at the establishment a few years back. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. As always, if you have suggestions for future topics, use the link in the description box below. And we'll see you again in Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.